there was Candy Bar. He would turn on a 16mm projector and say, "There he is! She's banned in Texas right now, but I've got the latest film on 16." Robert Crane just said that the tapes were real and not just a story. Dozens of real tapes made by his father, the man America used to love. Bob Crane was the funny and likable star of Hogan's Heroes for many years, and was TV's golden boy. But when police went into his flat in Scottsdale in 1978, they found something that no one could understand. He left behind cameras, wires, and tapes that would change the course of history forever. Robert was 20 years old when his dad first played him some of those records. After many years, he finally told everyone what he saw and how it showed that his father was hiding a double life. Because there was a reel of laughter hiding behind every reel that no one was supposed to see. Now that it's been 50 years, Bob Crane's son is ready to tell the truth. It wasn't just about the music on those tapes. It was also about the person who made them. Bob Crane was one of the most respected men on TV before the scandal, the tapes, and the news stories that would follow his family for decades. His charm was something that could not be taught. Quick, smart, and always liked. In the mid-1960s, people who watched Hogan's Heroes saw him as the smart, nice Colonel Hogan who could beat anyone. But that certainty wasn't fake. It was what he did. He made everyone around him feel like they were being seen. Crane's rise began in radio. Before he became famous on TV, he was the most popular morning show in Los Angeles. Playing records, talking with famous people, and charming a crowd that felt like extended family. The producers liked the timing, the humor, and the kindness. The movie business soon called. In 1965, Crane was the star of a popular TV show that shaped the way his generation watched TV. The picture was just as good at home. He has a wife, 3 kids, a house in the valley, and is known as the man next door. People wrote him letters calling him the nicest guy on TV. People who worked with him remembered a man who always knew his lines and never raised his voice. Stability, control, and success were shown by all the signs. But there were hints of something else, an energy that never turned off, even in those great years. Crane liked being noticed, but he liked technology even more. He got all of the new gadgets that were coming to Hollywood, while most actors didn't care about them. Cameras, recorders, and early camcorders that record on tape. He was interested in how they worked. He caught practices, parties, and breaks in between scenes on film. His co-stars thought it was just light-hearted excitement. Back then, recording home films wasn't uncommon. But Crane was more interested than that. He wasn't happy just recording events. He wanted to record how people felt, what they were saying, and how they laughed. He often carried a camera on set like other people brought scripts. He'd set it up in the green room, play jokes on it, and then show the videos to everyone to make them laugh. His co-workers saw it as a fun hobby. Not many people knew it was turning into an obsession over time. Crane's work changed when Hogan's Heroes ended in 1971, and he started doing theater and public speaking. The cameras were always on him. Videotapes were brand new, expensive, and hard to find at that time, but Crane had mastered them. His friends said he could quickly run lines through a room and make editing stations out of old hotel suites. Filming wasn't just his job, it was how he breathed. His oldest son, Robert Crane, remembers going to those plays and seeing his dad entertain huge crowds, then go backstage and start messing around with recording gear right away. He always had a camera on him, Robert later said, even when no one asked him to be. These little things helped make the double life start to take shape. People saw a comic who was still enjoying his success. It wasn't because he was lonely, curious, or out of control, but because he was keeping track of everything and saving pieces of his life on tape. No one knew. By the middle of the 1970s, the practice had turned into something he couldn't break. Those who knew him best could tell that he had changed, not in how funny or kind he was, but in how focused he was. The cams didn't seem to be about memories as much as they were about proof. It was like he was keeping track of a life he hardly thought he was living. His co-stars and family thought it was just one of his quirks. For Robert, it would all make sense years from now. The father, who looked so happy on screen, had already begun to record a secret that would change their lives forever. By the middle of the 1970s, Bob Crane's life was no longer about the cameras. They were friends. The tripods, wires, and boxes of reels were the first things he packed whenever he went on tour for theater or guest spots. People still welcomed him with open arms. Then there were the lines and flickering red record lights that were around him when he wasn't on stage. Around this time, he met John Carpenter, who was in charge of sales for a company that made video equipment in the area. A lot of hotels and film companies bought early Sony recorders from Carpenter, and Crane quickly became his best customer. The two men were both interested in the new medium. It was almost unheard of back then that they could shoot, pause, and watch all at the same time. What started out as a hobby became a passion that made it hard to tell the difference between fun and being close. Later, interviews and police records proved that Crane and Carpenter started to record the women they met on the road. The women seemed to be aware that they were being filmed, but the sheer number of tapes showed that they were more interested in gathering them than remembering what happened. Having power over the picture seemed to be the most important thing. Investigators would record hundreds of hours of video from Crane's private life, which spanned almost a decade. Crane still worked very hard at his job. He was the star of dinner theater comedies, and smiled during curtain calls, posed for pictures, and greeted fans who brought old Hogan's Heroes souvenirs for him to sign. Few people would have thought that he would go back to his rented room after the cheers to thread another tape. Later, his co-stars said he was antsy and couldn't sit still unless a camera was rolling. Robert Crane, who was in his early 20s at the time, went to see his dad every once in a while during this time. In his autobiography, he wrote about a time when Bob showed him several tapes and was happy to show off his editing setup. There were no direct threats, but the mood seemed off. He seemed to want me to see how smart he was. Robert later said, "I saw that the cameras were more than just tools. They were a part of him." Friends noticed that Carpenter was almost always close, setting up gear, testing monitors, and taking the bus between shows with them. From the outside, it looked like a friendly relationship based on shared hobbies. But people on the inside felt dependent. Crane used to be the star, with a lot of cast and crew around him. Now, when he wasn't on stage, he spent most of his time with the person who ran the machines. The pattern had become stronger by 1978. Crane's personal relationship got worse. His marriage to Patricia Olson ended, and job offers stopped coming in. It had gone from being interesting to being a safe place to be. Connection seemed to be replaced by recording. Even when he was just chatting, he talked about recording instead of living. Later, Robert would say that he understood his dad's need for control, and that making films gave him a sense of power when everything else was falling apart. But the habit that made him sure was about to reveal everything he wanted to keep secret. In a few months, those tools would be used as proof, and his private life, which he built behind the camera, would clash with the public image he had worked so hard to build over 20 years. While on tour with his comedy show Beginner's Luck in June 1978, Bob Crane went to Arizona for another run. It was the same old work. Still, everyone around him could tell he was tired. People who remembered how charming Hogan's Heroes were still came to see him in small theaters far from Hollywood when he was 49 years old. He talked to his son on the phone a lot between shows, making jokes about upcoming projects, and the new camera gear he brought with him. A normal chat was having until the call ended. A co-star went to Crane's flat in Scottsdale on the morning of June 29, 1978, because he had missed a practice. What she found would kill someone and make someone else public. Crane was found dead in his bed by the police, and what they saw around him shocked them. Tripods, recorders, wires that are tangled, and shelves full of videotapes. There were no signs of breaking in or theft, and nothing was missing. Within hours, everyone who knew Bob Crane as a TV hero found out that he had been living a secret life that not many people could understand. A lot of news sources were quick to report on the strange mix of fame, technology, and privacy. Detectives organized the tapes and photos, which proved what Crane and John Carpenter's friends had already thought. They had recorded dozens of intimate meetings. The material wasn't illegal, but it revealed the depth of his compulsion. In the glare of national headlines, his image collapsed overnight. To many fans, the man who once symbolized clever innocence now seemed unrecognizable. Robert Crane was in Los Angeles when the news broke. In interviews decades later, he recalled the disbelief that followed. "I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to know," he said. "The scandal came first, the grief second." Reporters called his home, neighbors asked questions, and even family friends avoided eye contact. What hurt most wasn't only the loss of a father, but the realization that the man he'd admired had been living under a second spotlight, one hidden from everyone who loved him. For months, police focused on John Carpenter. A faint trace of blood found in Carpenter's rental car tied him to the scene, but testing in the 1970s was primitive. He denied involvement and was released. The case went cold until new DNA methods in the early 1990s led to his trial, which ended in acquittal. Legally, the mystery remained unsolved. Culturally, the verdict changed little. Bob Crane's death had already become shorter-than for Hollywood excess. Robert avoided interviews for decades. He built a career as a journalist and publicist, quietly carrying the story everyone wanted him to tell. The tapes were still locked away by authorities. The investigation files sealed, but the questions never stopped. When a true crime book revived the case in the early 2000s, he realized silence was no longer protection. It was erasure. People were defining his father by rumor, not by truth. That decision led him to begin writing. In his memoir, Robert Crane doesn't defend what his father did, but he insists on separating myth from fact. The tapes existed. The obsession was real, but behind them was a man unable to turn the camera off. A man driven by curiosity, loneliness, and need for affirmation. He wasn't proud of it, Robert said. He was trapped by it. The death exposed the secret, but the aftermath exposed the cost. A family forced to live inside a headline. For Robert, understanding that contradiction, genius and weakness, fame and emptiness, became the only way to move forward. The double life that once shamed him would eventually become the truth he used to set the record straight. For years after his father Seeb's death, Robert Crane avoided every question connected to it. Reporters wanted details about the murder, the tapes, the secret life. He refused all of them. "I wasn't September ready," he later admitted. "I didn't September even know how to explain him to myself." Instead, Robert built a career behind the scenes in entertainment journalism and publicity, deliberately distancing himself from the scandal. Yet, the shadow never left. Whenever Bob Crane's name appeared in a magazine or documentary, Robert's phone would ring. Producers wanted family access. Newspaper editors wanted a quote. And strangers offered theories about what really happened in that Scottsdale apartment. For a long time, his answer was silence. That began to change in the early 2000s. A new generation of crime writers and television specials revisited the unsolved case, often focusing on the most sensational parts, the tapes, the women, the speculation about guilt. Robert watched as the father he'd loved became a symbol for Hollywood hypocrisy. Stripped of the humor, discipline, and kindness that once defined him, he realized that silence allowed myth to replace memory. So he decided to speak, not to defend, but to clarify. Together with journalist Christopher Fryer, he began writing the book that would finally confront everything: Crane, sex, celebrity, and my father's unsolved murder. It was part memoir, part investigation, and entirely an act of reconciliation. The research forced him to relive scenes he'd spent decades trying to forget. Phone calls from the police, the confusion of seeing his father's name beside tabloid headlines, and the moment he learned about the tapes. Robert sought accuracy over sympathy. He confirmed that his father had filmed many of his private encounters, and that John Carpenter had been deeply involved. But he also described the man behind the obsession: funny, generous, occasionally insecure, and endlessly curious. He wasn't a villain, Robert wrote. He was a man who didn't know when to stop. In interviews promoting the book, he spoke calmly about seeing some of the recordings years earlier, when his father proudly demonstrated his editing equipment. "It wasn't explicit," he explained, "but it told me enough. He needed to be admired all the time, even off camera." That simple admission gave the public its first honest look at how addiction to attention can distort a life built on performance. The book's release surprised critics. Instead of another scandal exposed, it felt like a son's attempt to take control of a narrative that had spiraled without him. Robert confronted the contradictions directly. The father who could make anyone laugh yet struggled with isolation. The entertainer who recorded everyone around him, but rarely listened. The family man who couldn't live a private life. He refused to sanitize or sensationalize. He simply presented facts, letting readers draw their own conclusions. What resonated most was his empathy. Robert never excused his father's behavior, but he humanized it. "He was addicted to being liked," he said in one interview. "When the camera stopped, he didn't know who he was." That insight reframed decades of tabloid coverage. It shifted the conversation from scandal to understanding, from shock to context. By the time Robert turned 53, he had lived longer than his father ever did. The silence he once used as protection had become its own burden. Telling the truth fully, factually, and without shame was the only way to set both of them free. The story that once embarrassed him had become the story that finally explained them both. When Robert Crane finally decided to speak, it wasn't to rewrite history. It was to reclaim it. He had spent half his life watching strangers define his father through headlines and hearsay. Now, after decades of silence, he wanted the record to be clear. Bob Crane was not the caricature that gossip had created. He was a man with extraordinary charm, deep flaws, and a fascination that turned into compulsion. By the time the book was published, the world had changed. Technology was everywhere. Privacy had become a relic. What once seemed scandalous now felt prophetic. In interviews, Robert often reflected on how his father's obsession foreshadowed an age when everyone records themselves. He was addicted to attention before attention was a currency. He said he couldn't live without being seen. The reaction surprised him. Fans who had loved Hogan's Heroes wrote letters thanking him for context rather than judgment. Some admitted they had condemned his father for years without understanding the loneliness behind his choices. Others saw a tragedy in how a man so gifted at making people laugh could lose himself to the need for validation. Robert answered each message with quiet gratitude. For the first time, the conversation was about understanding, not scandal. Privately, he knew that forgiveness didn't erase the pain. The family had endured decades of whispers, and the murder case remained officially unsolved. Yet, confronting the truth allowed him to stop living as the keeper of a secret he never chose. The only way to make peace with him, he once said, was to tell the story exactly as it happened. The truth, when stripped of myth, was complicated but human. Bob Crane wasn't a villain hiding in plain sight. He was a man consumed by technology and loneliness. A performer who couldn't separate connection from performance. His cameras gave him control, but they also trapped him. In the end, they recorded not triumph, but isolation. That was the legacy his son had to face and ultimately forgive. Robert's voice brought balance to a narrative that had long belonged to outsiders. He acknowledged his father's mistakes, but restored the man behind them. The father who played drums with him in the living room. The entertainer who worked tirelessly. The man whose laughter filled a house, now remembered only for scandal. If I didn't tell his story, he said someone else would, and they'd get it wrong. The tapes that once symbolized shame became symbols of truth. They proved how far one person would go to capture life even as it slipped away. For Robert, understanding that need became a form of release. In telling the story, he finally let go of the burden of silence. Half a century after the headlines faded, Bob Crane's name still carries a mixture of nostalgia and intrigue. But thanks to his son, the final chapter isn't about crime or gossip. It's about recognition. A man destroyed by the need to be seen is finally seen for who he really was. Flawed, lonely, talented, and human. The tapes that once exposed a secret became the proof of a deeper truth that fame without balance consumes itself. Robert Crane's courage transformed a family tragedy into an honest portrait of a man both celebrated and lost. He didn't rewrite his father's story, he finished it. Today, when audiences revisit Hogan's Heroes, they see more than a smiling face from a simpler time. They see the cost of that smile and the son who refused to let the truth die with it.